Thank you very much. I'm so grateful for the invitation to talk to this group. I read the newsletter, which comes to me by email, and I'd like to compliment Sam and his staff, his Department of Youth Evangelisation, on the quality of the newsletter. There's an awful lot of junk that comes into inboxes nowadays, but this is a really good thing. It's well put together, well chosen material. Now, I'm talking to a youth group, and I recognise that it's been 50 years since I was last qualified to do so. So it's quite an experience to come back and to talk to a group of this sort. I've been a teacher for most of my life, one way or the other. I'd left school early, actually, because I hated school, and I eventually trickled it back into the educational system and then became a teacher at schools and at universities too. And it always puzzled me, because I was a bit of a nerd, I suppose, that the whole world got enthusiastic about moving balls around. And it still puzzles me. You probably wonder what on earth I'm talking about. I've taken leave of my senses before I've even begun. But you know, the obsession that people have from childhood on with the movement of balls, golf balls, footballs, baseball balls, soccer balls, cricket balls, and all the rest of it, moving them around in a certain compass of area and finding the best and fastest ways to do it. You're puzzled by this? You're thinking what an unsporty nerd this guy is, but I always marched to the beat of a different drum, I think. I do admire people for their devotion to sport, to ball games, but I'm also worried that kids I've taught over the years have had no interest whatever in the things of the mind, and so that's always worried me a little bit. I think it's good to be sporty, it's good to be interested in ball games and to be good at cricket or football or something, but it's also terribly important to understand, to be excited by the mind. Because one of the most powerful things in the world is ideas. Ideas are super powerful things. And it doesn't, if you contemplate that one for a while, it won't be long before I think you'll see my point, or you've probably seen it already. But here are some examples of bad ideas that Jews are bringing down the government, that Jews are subhuman and they're doing harm to our country, so they should be eradicated, that people of a different colour, with a different coloured skin, are somehow not quite human, that disease is all a matter of bad air. It doesn't matter about nothing to do with rats or lack of hygiene in the operating theatre. That vengeance is the appropriate response to being hurt by somebody else. Those are all bad ideas. Sometimes they're brought about through ignorance, sometimes they're brought about through selfishness, but they have, not only are they bad ideas, but they often have really bad consequences. So I'm thinking Nazi Germany and the concentration camps, the spread of plagues by rats when nobody knew the reason for the plague, and things of that sort. And then there are neutral ideas, ideas that are neither good nor bad particularly. They might be very attractive ideas. The idea that it's good to have a lot of money, to be very rich. The idea that life is all about having fun and having adventures and doing exciting things. They're probably better than neutral, some of these. They're actually quite good, but they're not really top good. They're not the sort of things that are really going to make our lives in the long run successful. But the really good ideas are things like the golden rule, the idea that we should actually treat our neighbour as we would want to be treated by our neighbour, that the Samaritan is worth looking after, even though he's a foreigner, he comes from somebody else and he has a different accent and a different coloured skin perhaps, he still deserves to be looked after. And above all, the idea that God is love, that God actually is love, that love is the power that drives the universe. These are good ideas, and they can have tremendous consequences, tremendously good consequences. And another idea, and this is a difficult one for us to deal with, I think, for all of us, because we never can deal with it, is the idea that God is eternal, that God lives in eternity, and that we live in time. And we are like, imagine somebody being born blind and never understanding what it means to see. And that, I suppose, is our situation in relation to God. Our mental capacities are blind compared to his. A couple of the early saints of the church, I'm so glad you talked about standing on the shoulders of giants, Sam, but a couple of the early heroes of the church, somebody called Boethius and better known St. Augustine, talked about the nature of God's understanding of the universe. And he said, he defined eternity as being simultaneously in the total possession of the whole of your being. So God has no past, he has no future, he has an ever-present, that the whole of life is encompassed by the mind of God, simultaneously. So God knows the end, and he knows the beginning. And of course, we have in the 8th chapter, I think it is, of St. John's Gospel, we have Christ himself saying, "Before Abraham was, I am." It's the most powerful thing, isn't it? God sees it all. And one of the great consolations of that, of course, is that we know, though we may be horrified by the state of the world at various times, we know that the battle has been won and that the goodies have won. We know that, even though it may not be obvious at the moment. Okay, so that's my sort of preamble about ideas. And for those of you who are fanatical sports people, ball game players, I apologize if I've caused offense. But I see one tennis player looking at me there. But I don't mean to put these things down, but I'm just saying what a sad thing it is from a teacher's point of view, that people are very interested in sports, but not at all interested in the things of the mind, or so often they're not, you know. Anyway, so just a little bit of autobiographical stuff. My background is in classics, which further sets me out as a bit eccentric, I suppose. In other words, the things I loved most as a student were Greek and Latin and also literature of other languages, including our own. And so that's given me a certain. I don't regret that background. I think I'm pleased to have had that background. I think it gives one a sort of perspective about time, about the passage of time. It makes you put things in perspective, because so many silly things are said today, particularly nowadays when so little history is taught. So many silly things are said about the nature of the world and about people. But I love the classics, and I love that sense of proportion you get from looking at the world which is now gone, and seeing, as it were, face to face, a mind from 2,000 years ago in the pages of a book, and seeing how they look. They're as human as you are. They're at least as clever as you are, and probably damn sight more so. But they think differently about some things, and that, I think, is absolutely fascinating. And one of the things they think differently about, I reckon, in the ancient world generally, by and large, is the nature of love. I think it's hard to find in the writers of the ancient world very much that we recognize as love in the Christian sense. And I mean sort of, do you know the different types of love? There's eros, there's philia, there's agape. If anybody's read the Four Loves by C.S. Lewis, will have come across this. But that's that kind of loving of another creature for the sake of loving, and not for the purpose of gaining anything. That highest form of love. Yes, you do find it in the ancient authors, but it's harder to find. And then when you come to St. Paul saying in the Epistle to the Galatians, there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither bond nor free, there is neither male nor female, for ye are all one in Christ Jesus. That, I think, was the most revolutionary thing that's ever been said. I don't think it had been found anywhere else. I don't think anybody in the world before had said anything like it. I might be quite wrong, but to my knowledge, nothing like that had ever been said previously. Because in the ancient world, the ideas prevailed, so many funny ideas prevailed about, for example, Aristotle thought that slaves were naturally servile, that there was something defective in their character. And so many prejudices of that kind existed in the ancient world, as they do in our world, but in the ancient world they were unchallenged by any other opinion, unchallenged by views like that of St. Paul. So I guess the next thing I want to do is to ask myself why that brilliant idea that there is neither Jew nor Greek, neither bond, slave nor free, neither male nor female, why hasn't it taken on? Why doesn't it, the marvelous, elegant simplicity of the thing, why hasn't it transformed our lives ever since? And the only answer to that, I suppose, is that it has taken on, but always with a minority of people. The people who acted on that have always been in the minority, never had the upper hand completely. There might have been times and places when they did, but in general, that's not the case. And these ideas have always been never achieved absolute universal acceptability, whether by the hand of the devil, the wiles of the devil, or by the frailty of humankind. Bad counsels have usually prevailed throughout our history. And it's characteristic of grumpy old men like me that we complain and we say things like, oh, things were better when I was a kid, we never had that sort of stuff, and all the stuff that's going on now is just dreadful. Of course, we've always been doing that. The old have been saying that about the young for 2,000 years and more. That's one of the things we know from the classics. There have always been old grizzlers who complained that things were better in my boyhood. But the fact is, it's a pipe dream. It's a pipe dream. There was no golden age. There was no time when everything was perfect in the world, in our civilization or in any other. We like to think that things have got worse. I think probably in many respects they have got worse in recent years, and that's another question. We'll look at that later. But in general, life has been fluctuating between the kind and the selfish, between the good and the bad, between the generous and the mean, throughout human history. But this is not to say that some ages haven't been better than others. I was talking to somebody recently, some historian friend recently, and said, what age would you have preferred to live in? And he said, absolutely none but the present. We have anesthetics, we've got public services, we've got so many benefits that our forefathers couldn't have dreamt of. We're not running the risk of starving to death. It's the best age that ever has been known for human beings. And it's pretty hard to belie that, particularly if you live in a prosperous Western country like Australia. It's a pretty damn good place to live. Whereas to contrast that with the persecution of Christians by the Romans, which wasn't unvariable. I mean, there would be sudden persecutions launched by particularly irritable emperors against the Christian population, and they would seek them out and they would actively bring them in and torture them and kill them. There was that, and there was the treatment of the Jews by the Germans, or of Christians by the communists in Russia under the inspiration of men like Lenin and under the hand of people like Stalin. There have been some ghastly times. And we hear that in China today there are some dreadful abuses taking place against minority groups, including the harvesting of organs and the forced re-education of subgroups within the community. We hear that these things are happening, and undoubtedly there are some people in the world who live in conditions of terrible fear and trauma. Just the other day I read that in the last 5 years there have been 80,000 Christians and about 30,000 Muslims murdered for their faith in Nigeria, in one country in Africa. Admittedly the biggest and most populous country in Africa, but still they're horrendous figures. So, and I've got to add too that Christians are not guiltless. Think of the burning of witches, not just in Massachusetts, but in other parts of Europe during the late Middle Ages and early modern era. Think of the persecution of Protestants by Catholics and of Catholics by Protestants at various times, almost up to modern times. Almost up to modern times. Think of Spain. The attack on Christians by the communists in Spain during the Civil War, and think of the various Christian groups fighting each other bitterly, leaving behind their Christian impulses and allowing them to be smothered and overcome by worldly ambitions. So anyway, that's we're not blameless. We're not blameless either. We can't just complain of being victims all the time because we've often been aggressors. So are we heading now for bad times? That's a good question. Most of us would prefer to say things are getting better. Most of my friends would say, yeah, the world's getting better by and large. People are kinder than they used to be. And there's some truth in that, but I can't help feeling that the truth lies elsewhere, that in fact, in many ways, things are getting worse. And I look, for example, to there's a constant sort of tussle between optimism and reality, you know. And I also notice, as somebody who's interested in history, that good times and bad times often occur simultaneously. So, for example, in the late 18th century, people were developing very humane ideas, or more, they were advancing in the search for humane ideas about the treatment, say, of native peoples in countries conquered by Western nations, in the treatment of women, in the treatment of children in the factories, in abolishing slavery, of course. That's the chief among them. But at the same time, that very same time, the late 18th century, slavery was reaching its peak. So you got the worst things happening at the very same time that people were most ambitious about reforming them. And that's a strange thing, isn't it, in history, that things happen at the same time. So and those of us who are living in the middle of our history can't always tell who's winning. You know, we see good things, we see bad things. We don't know where it's all going to end. Well, actually, going back to eternity, of course, we do know where it will end. But in the meantime, we don't. And that's a hard one. But think of some of the contrasts. From my age group, I can remember personally the time when all forms of censorship were overturned in the 1960s. And time and again, move after move, court decision after court decision, censorship was simply thrown out. So pornography, particularly, I think, the most important one of the lot, was because it's so powerful potentially. Pornography was completely out in the open. All bets were off. Everything was legal. And then from that, of course, arose a whole growth in the child pornography industry, It just came from nowhere. It had always been there, of course, but small and underground and illegal. And then suddenly it became legal, and it grew into an enormous and dangerous force in our society. But now we're backtracking on that. I mean, it's a good thing that we're backtracking on child pornography, but we're backtracking on almost everything else as well. It's almost like a complete overreaction. Nowadays, there are people who want to shut down almost everything they don't like. And so you've got laws against insulting people or hurting people's feelings. And these laws are actually being enacted, enforced rather, so that you can be arrested for saying something that offends somebody else. In some jurisdictions, not always, and not in all, but in some jurisdictions you can. And there are plenty of people around who want to enforce that. There are young people who want to say, people who have a particular viewpoint about life, say for example who are anti-abortion, should not be allowed to speak in public. There are people saying things like that. So from a time of 60 years ago, let it all hang out, anybody is entitled to say anything they like, we've reached the stage now where people are bending over themselves to make things illegal. And the suppression of free speech has become a serious issue for us in the West. All right, so that's more or less how are we going for time. I hope I'm not boring the socks off you, but it's interesting. I can't see the audience very well because of the light, so it's like I feel as though I'm talking into the darkness there. You know, you may all have left for all I know. When Archbishop Porteous came to Hobart in 2013. He asked me to set up some sort of organisation to help to promote what he called the Catholic intellectual tradition. And that the Dawson Centre arose out of that. And the point was, of course, that our particular task was not evangelisation. We leave that to others. Our particular role was to try to show that it's reasonable for a thinking man or woman to be a Christian, to be a Catholic Christian. It's reasonable. It's not fanatical, superstitious ignorance. It's perfectly reasonable. And I think having a historical perspective is a good one, is a useful one, because if we can see how bizarre atheism is, how unusual it is in human history. And yet nowadays it's the default position for most people. So our job, I think, is to try and battle that attitude that there's something peculiar about religious belief. And Dawson, Christopher Dawson himself, was a great historian of the 20th century who died in about 1970. I should know, shouldn't I? I think 69 or 70. Who understood most clearly the links between religion and culture. And he saw religion being attacked from both the left and the right, Nazis in Germany and communists in Russia. And he believed that the civilization of the West simply could not survive if it lost its religion. Culture could not survive if religion had gone, because with religion, with the departure of religion, we lose every yardstick by which human behavior is measured, every moral yardstick. And looking around at us now, we see ample evidence for this, that we've lost our moral compass. Most people have lost their moral compass, but we who are Christians have an obligation to do all we possibly can to stand up and be courageous and express our views. And there aren't many who are courageous enough to do that, particularly when, unlike somebody like me who's retired, particularly when they're working in jobs and their bosses require them to behave in certain ways and even to believe certain things. And that makes life very difficult, and very few people are brave enough to stand up against that kind of pressure. But it's important for those who are brave enough to stand up against pressure to be seen to do so, and thereby to give good heart to those who are faltering and are inclined to throw in the towel. So, well, that's not, I don't know whether that's a particularly cheerful note to end on, but maybe just recapping, God knows that how it will end, and we know that the ending will be good. And I like old Julian of Norwich, and all things shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. That's the nice positive note to finish with. Thank you all very much. Thank you for filling your hearing.